Well, thank you very much, Vidya, for that great introduction. I'm glad you didn't take too long, because I always take too long. This subject is so interesting for me, I don't want to keep you back from your Friday night entertainments too long, but I apologize in advance, because I almost always go over time, because even the period I'm going to talk about, which is not my familiar period, my period is the 14th through 16th century, but I was asked to talk about this blank period, more or less, in Singapore history from 1600 to 1800, which is not entirely a blank from the archaeological point of view. I'm showing you all the artifacts we have. Out of 1 million, we've got these. These are the artifacts from the 17th century. We've dug up 1 million artifacts, approximately, in Singapore from the pre-colonial period. And well, this is it, from the period of 1600 through 1800. Now, the one on the left is a well-known style of pottery made in the Netherlands. In the 17th century, it's called Delftware because that's where it was made, very distinctive. And on the right side, we have these 4 sherds of Chinese ware, which has a specific name in archaeology called Delftware. Oh, sorry, called Batavia ware, because it was made in the probably Jingda 10, but for the Dutch in Indonesia, and for the Chinese who lived in Indonesia during this period. So it's very distinctive. It's got the brown exterior, which is not a Chinese style at all. And the interior, it's got this blue and white. So it's a combination of these 2 colors, which probably was never used in China at all. It was purely made for the export market to Indonesia. So these were both all found at the St. Andrews Cathedral site. Well, you'll see STA stands for St. Andrews, SAL stands for salvage. That means it was dug up, not by us in our archaeological excavation, but there was also some ditching going on using an excavator in the grounds. And so we went through that and we picked up all the artifacts from there, and they came out of that sieve. So although we can't say it came from a certain soil layer, we can say, yeah, there was somebody walking around St. Andrews Cathedral grounds during the 1600s era, the late Ming, early Qing. Probably we will find a few more when we continue our analysis of the artifacts. So we do have these huge quantities of materials that are still in an early phase of analysis now. But so far, we do have a little bit to say that there was actually some kind of presence here on the land. But no doubt, there were people living in Singapore in 1600s, 1700s, but not on land. Most of them were probably either living on boats in estuaries, like the Kallang estuary or the Singapore River estuary, or in the Keppel Harbor area, or they were living on houses built on stilts, because we have descriptions of them in the historical sources. So there were people here, the Dutch, the Chinese, who came here in the 1600s, 1700s, mentioned them. They acquired various commodities from them. And the people of Singapore at this time were basically the type that in general we often call the orang laut, the sea nomads, because they did live over water, not on land, so they didn't leave much for us archaeologists to find. But they were used fairly frequently as pawns in the larger power games. There were lots of power struggles going on in the Singapore area between a huge range of different people, all the way from North Sumatra, the Acehnese, down to the South Sumatra area, down to Java, including also people like the Dutch, the Portuguese, the English, the Bugis from eastern Indonesia. All these people, their conflicts had a strong impact on Singapore during this period. And the Singaporeans of that period often got swept up by these, and several times what did exist in Singapore probably got smashed by one or another of these groups, which is why probably there was not a huge quantity of artifacts to be found on land. So unfortunately, I can't do my normal kind of talk and show you lots of nice pictures. I'm going to have a lot of words instead, but I'll try to fill in the blanks between the pictures as much as I can. So this is the black zone, the black hole of Singapore history, 1600, 1800. But Singapore was not forgotten by any means, even though archaeologically it didn't leave a huge footprint. But it was a settlement, it was a port, and a strategic location along this busy maritime artery now recognized and fought over by local rulers and European traders as well. The Portuguese arrived in the Straits in 1509. They quickly realized that Singapore had great strategic value. And because it's at the junction of the South China Sea routes, the routes going from China down to Indonesia, and the ones going between the South China Sea and the Bay of Bengal. So the Portuguese, Captain Alfonso d'Albuquerque, believed that, and this is what he wrote in his diary. Before Malacca was founded, Singapura was a very large and very populous city. This is the Portuguese conqueror of Malacca, and that's what he wrote. And attested to by its great ruins. He saw great ruins here, which are visible still to this very day. That's like 1515. and was under obedience to the king of Siam. Singapura, once the city takes its name, is a channel. So the channel was the real place, and the settlement was named after the channel, according to his understanding, through which passes all the shipping for these parts. And it means, in the Malay language, treacherous delay. That's not true. He didn't know Malay or Sanskrit, obviously. But that's what they seem to associate with Singapore for some very good reasons, meteorological and oceanographic. And this name suits the place very well, for sometimes when ships are waiting there for a monsoon, a storm comes up so violently that they are lost. That's, of course, the wind we call the monsoon, or the Sumatra. The name Sumatra also meant this strong winds that come up seeming out of nowhere. In 5 minutes, if you don't take your sails down, your ship can be capsized, still today. Very unpredictable. And so what would happen is that because in this equatorial zone, the winds are not predictable, they have to wait outside Singapore Harbor for the right wind to take them around the point of Singapore, whichever direction they're going, east or west. And while they were waiting, suddenly this huge wind would come out of nowhere and shipwreck them. So treacherous delay was, in fact, they would be delaying, waiting for the right wind or the right tide, also very critical again. And if they were not lucky, they might get wrecked. So Malacca, on the other hand, is at the end of the monsoons, where you find everything you're looking for, and sometimes more than you're looking for, is what the Portuguese used to say. So whoever's lord of Malacca has his hand on the throat of Venice. That is what the Portuguese believed before they got here. Because the Portuguese, of course, were trying to outdo the Venetians. Venice, of course, was built during this golden age in the 15th century. And it was riches, believe it or not, came from Southeast Asia, the spice trade. Because Venice had the monopoly of trade with the Mamluk sultans of Egypt, who controlled the overland route between the Indian Ocean and the Mediterranean. So the Venetians had the monopoly on the peppers and the other spices. And so the Portuguese figured they couldn't beat the Venetians by going east through the Mediterranean. So they spent like 60 years figuring out how to go around Africa. Prince Henry the Navigator and so on. And they were very persistent. In the end, they figured out how to do it. And once they got around the south tip of Africa, then of course they went very quickly from 1498 all the way to India, and by 1509 to Malacca. And 2 years later, they conquered it. So already the Singapore area was in the midst of this great power struggle at that time between the Venetians and the Portuguese. So after the fall of Malacca in 1511, according to his Comentarios, published by his son in 1577, the Laksamana, this is the Malay term for the admiral of Malacca, traced his roots to Singapore. And so when the Portuguese drove the Sultan out of Malacca in 1511, the Laksamana, commander of Malacca's navy, a man of 80 years, a good soldier, and a good repute and knowledge, the Portuguese praised him because he was a good adversary for them. It was very kind of chivalrous at that time. He moved to Singapore. He may have been returning home, probably he was. Albuquerque said the Laksamana was joined by the fugitive Sultan Mahmud from Malacca, who briefly resided on Singapore around this time, 1511 or so. So the Laksamana, he never gives us his name, but he's very probably the man we know from Malay folklore as Hang Tuah. He would have been 80 years around at this time. That means he was probably born around 1430, which would mean that he was probably the person who wrote several letters to Japan, to Ryukyu, Okinawa, which are preserved in the Japanese records. So he was actually writing letters, not the Sultan of Malacca. And again, unfortunately, he doesn't ever sign his name. So we can't say this is Hang Tuah. What we can say is that it was the Admiral of Malacca was actually running the foreign affairs. He claims to have saved some Japanese sailors from shipwreck, sent them back to Okinawa. There's a lot in the Japanese records which have still not been studied about the relation of the position of Singapore in the 15th, early 16th centuries. So Hang Tuah was probably a Singaporean. He went home, came back here to get away from the Portuguese. So Pires, Tome Pires, he's the one who wrote the most besides Albuquerque. And he wasn't very complimentary about Singapura. Again, he called Singapura the channel. It has a few salates. Salates is the orang laut, the orang salat, the people of the strait. It has some villages on it, but it's nothing much. From there onwards, the said kingdom does not extend any further on land. By implication, it extends further on water. But on land, it didn't have a big footprint. The channel is a thing of little importance. I mean the people who live there. But he corrects himself. Then the channel is very important. So he's talking about the Keppel Harbor area. So the Salates, the sea nomads, Singapore was not their headquarters, Bintan was. So if you look at the Singapore area from their point of view, Singapore would be at the northern fringe. And their zone was the whole Rio archipelago, going down to Lingga, all these islands, and that whole huge area of eastern Sumatra. Because all of those estuaries there, also those were the people of the same general nature, their adaptation to life at sea. They inhabited that whole region. So from Singapore, hardly anybody ever looks west. But that, in fact, was one of the major kinds of areas where the Singapore identity was also expressed, besides here. Singapore, no doubt, was one of the main centers of it because of its position in the trade with India and China. But a lot of the people themselves would have resided in the east coast of Sumatra and come back and forth from there. Rokan, for example, that's one of the big rivers in the east coast of Sumatra opposite Singapore. So the vassal Malacca was called that. It was required to help in wartime with rowers and soldiers who were given only food for their service. This was the ancient relationship between the Malay rulers and the sea people, which probably goes back to Srivijaya, 800 years before Singapore even. Many of the people were salates, which the Portuguese said is the Malay word for sea robbers, again, pirates. So again, they had a bad reputation among the Portuguese. This is the Rokan River, by the way, down below here, lower right. So it's hard to talk about a sense of place for these salates, these sea people, because they were nomads. They sometimes spent short periods of time on land. They would grow crops at certain times of the year in different areas, but they would move back and forth in order to avoid the problems of the northeast monsoon, for example. When the northeast monsoon was blowing out of the South China Sea, they had to move to places which were sheltered from that aspect. Whereas when there's a southwest monsoon, they could spread around. They would usually travel around in fairly large groups, quite large numbers of families. They did have some kinds of territory, and therefore sometimes they were named after areas like the Orang Selitar, Orang Kalan, and so on. But they were not always living there. Those were maybe their main bases, but they moved around quite a bit, and they had their set territories, just like other nomadic groups usually did. So when Raffles arrived in Singapore, of course, there were still many Orang Laut, or sea nomads, living on boats in the Singapore River. So now this is one of these rivers in the east coast of Sumatra, and you can see you can surf on these rivers. This is one of the reasons why those rivers never became big centers of kingdoms, because you can't really sail up these rivers. You may get these tidal bores, as they're called, forming. So you can stay in the same place. You can surf on this wave, but you're not moving. The main wave is taking you one way, the current's taking you the other way. And so you can go surf on the rivers in Sumatra. This is when the big the tide comes in, the river comes back, you have a standing wave. And if you know the tides and the currents and so on, you can kind of predict this. But most foreign navigators would have no clue when this was going to happen. And so no major kingdoms formed up those rivers, but the local people certainly exploited a lot of the resources up those rivers, which go all the way to the gold sources in the Western Highlands. And quite a number of the small islands off the east coast there became early Chinese settlements. Now, this is Bagan Siapi-Api, for example, one of the big islands just west of Singapore. In the 19th century, it was totally Chinese, maybe 10,000 people, all based on fishing. And they still retain a lot of these old traditions, which you might have had in Singapore 100 years ago, and they still retain a lot of these characteristics. Here they are, here are they burning this big boat, again, obviously part of a major ritual. Again, it's another whole subject that hasn't been properly studied yet. And it's not really well known, but the whole area of this East Sumatran coast was a very important historical area, which was, again, part of the Singapore whole character. So according to the Portuguese understanding, and they collected a lot of this data from the Malays of the Singapore and Malacca area, he mentions 3 kings entitled Sang Aji. Sang, of course, is an honorific for a person, and Aji is your lordship, more or less. So His Majesty, more or less. These rulers were Palembang, Pontianak, and Singapore. And these are the 3 same places that are mentioned more or less in the Malay Annals, except instead of Singapore, it was Minangkabau. So all were vassals of Java, according to the Portuguese, but the Singapore ruler, Sang Aji, in 1500, was related by marriage to Patani, South Thailand. Paramaswara, a famous name in Malay folklore, but not in the Malay Annals, murdered the Sang Aji of Singapore about 1392, which probably had a big effect on the way the Malay Annals deal with Singapore. Thus they say that the Chinese used to have affinity with the Javanese. This is the Portuguese speaking again in 1500. And one king of China sent one of his daughters to Java to marry the Batara Raja Suda, and that he sent her to Java with many people of China. Of course, this is the same kind of legend you get in Malacca about the Chinese princess. Apparently that legend was quite popular in Southeast Asia, not just Malacca. It was a whole literary trope. And that he sent her to Java with many people of China, and that he then sent money in the cash, which are now currency, that's Chinese money, they use Chinese money. And they say that there was a junk load of them, and the king was a vassal, not a tributary of the king of China. Fine distinction. And that the Javanese killed all the Chinese in Java by treachery. Others say that it was not true. So you have both versions in the Portuguese sources. But that one king was never related to the other, and that the Java cash were brought to Java for merchandise, because the Chinese used to trade in Java long before Malacca existed. But now they have not been there for the last 100 years. Of course, this fits in with the whole Ming Gap, as we call it in archaeology. After the Ming came in, they closed off China for the next 150 years. And the Portuguese heard the stories of this from the locals. They remembered Chinese used to come to this area, used to go to Java, but then they stopped coming for over a century before the Portuguese arrived. And this also fits in with the fact that here in Singapore, we found several hundred of the old Chinese coins. In our research in Sumatra, Java also, obviously the Chinese coins were the international currency of the 16th century. So the Portuguese sailed through Keppel Harbor in August 1526. It was the route. They would go through the Keppel Harbor and then turn south. They didn't go straight down from Malacca. They go south and then east across Singapore and then south through the Karimata Strait. They claim to have wiped out Singapore in 1526, which might have been the old home port of Hang Tuah, Singapore's old Laksamana. So they claim to have destroyed Singapore, but then they say the town was, however, soon rebuilt. So it was not the once and for all devastation of Singapore, 1526. And then they mention this bay where the settlement, Polasau, Singapura was. They say they destroyed the settlement, but that the town was soon rebuilt. Singapore appears in the last chapter of the Malay Annals, which we have now, which is the Raffles version, which was probably written when the capital of the Malays was at Siong Pinang, which is up the Johor River in the 1530s, when the ruler was Alauddin Riayat Shah. Section 31 of the Annals mentions the story of a Singapore headman named Pate Adang, or Lundang, it's hard to read in the Jawi script, whose title was Sri Bija di Raja. So at this time, the Singapore ruler had this title, the Royal Sri Bija. He was killed, and his followers were granted to the ruler of Pahang, presumably moving there from Singapore. So the ruler was killed again by the ruler of Pahang. Again, the Singaporeans were probably forced to move there. One of the main objectives of warfare at this time was to capture people, not to take over their land, but to get human beings, because they needed labor. The region was still vastly underpopulated in the 1600s. His son, Sansetia Bentayan, however, was given the fief of Singapura. So there was some vestige of authority still here on Singapore, after Singapore was conquered by Pahang. In the mid-16th century, the Portuguese considered building a fort somewhere on the Singapore Strait. But the Viceroy of Goa, that's the Goa in northwest India, decided it was better to maintain a naval presence in the area rather than to build a land-based fort. And this argument, build a fort in Singapore or build a naval base, of course, that went on until the 1940s. And the British, of course, built a naval base, which had a major effect on how World War II came out. So that argument went on for 4 centuries. How best to exploit Singapore's location? Build big fortifications on land or build naval structures. So the British built a naval base, but they didn't put any ships in it. And so it didn't really help very much. So it's interesting. But what the Portuguese did was they did use Singapore as a naval base. Every year they sent 3 to 5 oared warships, and they still used, like Ben-Hur, the galleys, they still use them in the 16th century. 50 or 60 soldiers, they patrolled Singapore water. They didn't build anything on land to wait the Portuguese galleons coming down from Macau, which would, of course, try to go around the south tip of Malaysia and then turn up to get to Malacca. But that was a very difficult operation because they had to switch from going south to going north. It was not easy with these old ships, given the uncertain nature of the winds that are in this area. So people such as St. Francis Xavier sometimes signed his letters in Latin as ex freto Singapura, meaning that they were sent from the Straits of Singapore. He didn't mention any settlements or describe any other aspects of Singapore, suggesting he never actually went on shore. So this is the Singapore area, and the Malay capitals after the fall of Malacca fluctuated a lot in this region. Sometimes they were, of course, down on Lingga. That's where they were when the British arrived. Sometimes they're up on Bintan, but that's where the Bugis were the powers behind the throne. So these are the Singapore, Riau, Johor capitals during this period, the so-called Black Hole period, actually starting in the 1500s up until the mid-1800s. Siong Pinang, that's where the Malay Annals version was written. That's way up there. The capital is really far up the river to partially avoid or to defend against any kind of incursions. Then it moved down to Johor Lama, which means, of course, Old Johor, where there is quite a big archaeological site. And then it moved up to places like Bukit Seluyut, back to Johor Lama again, moved up to these other sites, Batu Sawar, Kota Tinggi, back down the river again. And so this is, if you look, of course, at the Johor Lama area, it's mainly an estuary. It's a huge open area, very good place for stationing ships. And that's where the Portuguese ships used to sit and wait for the galleons to come from Macau. And we have a very good description of the conquest of Old Johor Lama by the Portuguese in the 1580s. And we do have some, of course, remains along the Singapore River. So Singapore River was still a harbor for old Johor in the 1500s when Johor Lama was attacked. This is a description how the Portuguese got in the defenses of Johor Lama. It was very well defended. These are all the old embankments. And they found a way to go north, land north of the fort, then come back down, get behind the defenses, come through this one gateway. It was a very arduous struggle for them to capture it. And we have some of these ruins of the old tombstones, have remains of the gun emplacements where they had the large numbers of cannon at this time. So in the Malay Annals, when they talk about the Parit Singapura and the old lines of Singapore, which the British still found, that's what they looked like, the one in the upper right. That's probably like the old fort wall, which ran right in front of the old museum here. That still existed when Raffles arrived here, and then was leveled in the 1820s already. So in the age of sail, ships arriving from the west, from the Indian Ocean, would anchor off northwest tip of Sentosa, which is what the Chinese called the Longyamen, the Dragon's Tooth Strait. And they would do the same thing. They would rendezvous off of the west coast of Sentosa, waiting for the right tidal and wind conditions, and then they would shoot through Keppel Harbor. And so while they waited there, treacherous delay again, they would go ashore and they would buy food and provisions from the local people in Singapore. So there were still people here growing provisions, selling them to the passing ships. And they would sell fresh fruit, fish, and chicken. And they lived in round or thin, long covered boats, round boats or long, thin boats. And they got their jars, iron knives, tobacco, and other trifles in exchange for fish. That was the economy in the 1500s. And so that's why we got this tombstone. I'm sure many of you have been to Malacca. I've seen this tombstone there, which mentions Singapura. It's dated 1598, and it says that this was the tombstone of Petrus, hic jacet Dominus Petrus Societis Jesus. He was a Jesuit, and he was also the episcopus. He was the bishop of Japan, Japonensis. So the bishop of Japan, and he died in Singapore. But ex fratum, that means in the Straits of Singapore, on the board of the ship. So the ship was anchored there, probably waiting for the right winds. The bishop of Japan, the Portuguese bishop, who was probably based, of course, in Nagasaki, there died. And so his tombstone says he died in Singapore, 1598. And of course, we get these nice images of the ships of the time. Also, these would have been common sights passing across the south coast of Singapore in the 1500s, early 1600s. So they had round boats, which sounds very curious. They had various names for these. Sometimes they call them balois, which means balloon or bubble boats, or Roma, which is the Portuguese word for pomegranate. For some reason, the boats reminded them of fruits. And it also led to the name of this place called Ponta de Romania, Romania Point. That place name still exists today. It's named not after Rome, it's named after the round boat or the pomegranate. And they're still used today by fishermen in South Vietnam, where they call them basket boats. So when the ships were trying to sail through this patches at night, if they had to, they would try to do that. That's so the orang laut would help the ships get through the strait by placing round shells on the water with flammable tree resin, damar, to guide their vessels in the dark. And of course, you can still see these in Da Nang. They still use them. This is what we probably would have seen in Singapore in the 1500s, these round balois or pomegranate boats. And you still see the kids rolling around in these if you go to Da Nang today. So, of course, the problem was how to get through this very narrow strait. It seems that those who passing through the strait for the first time, that's impossible to find a way out, seeing themselves surrounded by land on all sides. In other words, an intricate labyrinth for ships to navigate. So why did they go through Keppel Harbor? Why didn't they go south through the Main Strait, which is like 15 kilometers wide? Why do they go through this tiny little thing between Sentosa and Labrador Point? The reasons are that the straits have these incredibly strong tides, which are stronger than the winds. The wind may blow your sails one way. The currents will take you backwards. It's that strong. Sometimes they compare them to a river in the sea. So in the age of sail, ships avoided the currents of the main strait by hugging the coast of Singapore Island. Of course, they still had to know exactly when the tide was going to turn, but they very rarely ventured through the main strait because of the currents. And that's what happened to this one big Spanish galleon. He passed by Singapore in the northeast monsoon coming down from China, or maybe from Manila. I think it was coming from Manila. He had 10 galleons and about 3,000 soldiers. And he said, no, I can't get through that little narrow strait. I'm going to go through the main strait. And what happened? He got wrecked in the Singapore main strait because he couldn't, even a big galleon could not counteract the currents with his big sails. He was the first European known to have tried to use this passage, and this is in 1615, 100 years after the Portuguese had been here. The Europeans never tried that. They would always go through the Keppel Harbor. And so it became known as Governor's Strait, because he was the governor of the Spanish Philippines. It was known after him because he was so stupid as to try to go through the main strait. His pride, again, earned him a shipwreck. And so the British, it was known as the Governor's Strait until the British got here, and then they renamed it Phillips Channel. So if you look at the early Portuguese or Dutch descriptions, they see they always went along the south coast of Singapore Island. This is, if you look at Linschoten, for example, 1598, he wrote a very clear description of the route through Singapore Harbor. You can see how he hugged the coast, went through the Keppel Harbor. So people always wonder why they did that. Well, that's the reason. It was the currents. So that's again, his description goes right along the coast through the strait between Sentosa and Labrador. So we get a lot of these kinds of religious icons also from this period, indicating that how helpless often the sailors felt. This is a plaque, which is one of these interesting pieces of evidence of the fusion between European and Asian sources artistic sources at this time. This is, of course, made out of ivory. The Portuguese in India used ivory a lot for various kinds of artwork. And so this is Christ child as navigator, almost as a kind of patron saint to the shippers of this period. This is something that the Asian Civilizations Museum has acquired. Now, much of the political history of Singapore at this period, as opposed to being a navigational landmark and a place to pick up provisions, is empty. But this is not unique to Singapore. It's part of the whole history of Southeast Asia at this period. Tony Reed, in his book on the Age of Commerce, he described the whole area the period as the crisis of the 17th century. Japan, of course, went into seclusion at this time, cut itself off. The Ming Dynasty collapsed, 1643, and there was a period of disorder in China. Wars broke out in Europe and Turkey. Population around the known world declined in the 17th century. Chinese trade went into a severe slump, which affected Southeast Asian economies quite strongly. The East India companies of the Dutch and English had grave problems at this time. And so it was not unique to Singapore. The whole 17th century is kind of a dark age, again, in world history as a whole. So, and it began with the Dutch and the English bringing new sources of wealth for the traders, but also conflicts to the region. So the Southeast Asians were caught up in these rivalries, both between the Europeans with each other, the Catholics versus the Protestants, and also between the various Malays or people claiming to represent Malay identity at this period. So the Dutch figured out that the Portuguese used to use that Johor River estuary in the area between Changi and Johor as a place to wait because they were out of the northeast monsoon. They could wait for their ships coming down. So the Dutch began to station their own ships off of Changi Point to wait for the galleons. And they would attack them instead of shepherding them. They would capture them off of Changi Point. This was a very famous battle which took place there. And it's very well documented in the Dutch sources. So here they have these kind of battle plans. You see all the ships, they're very well organized. And so here are the ships coming down from the northeast, and here are the Dutch ships sailing out to get them. And so the Portuguese also had their own galleys. You can see all the rowers with the galleys in them, because of course the galleys could go against the wind. They were not subject to the winds. They could row against the wind, they could tow the big ships which they often did. They called that the sweeps, and they would actually tow the ships. They didn't get very fast, but at least they could tow them. And then the Dutch at this time became the allies of the Malays, because, of course, the Malays hated the Portuguese for having captured Malacca from them, and so the Dutch got the Malays to side with them, the Malays of Johor. And so the Malays said, this is where you want to wait, and we will help you. We'll go and scout and tell you when the Portuguese are coming. And so they would come down, and then they would go row out together. And so in 1603, the Dutch captured a major ship called the Santa Catarina. Had a valuable cargo of porcelain and Chinese merchandise coming down from Macau. This was a famous battle. And again, here you have all these points. Here's the Johor estuary at the upper right, and that's Singapore, Changi at the left. Again, these big battles took place off of there. And so you can study this in a fair amount of detail. And of course, lots of historians have. So they took the Santa Catarina, seem to be stuck here. Okay, there we go. So they took the ship back to Amsterdam and auctioned it off and made a huge profit from this. This is the first ship with a big cargo of Chinese porcelain ever to reach Europe. The whole 16th century, Portuguese didn't bring porcelain back to Europe. It was only the Dutch, when they captured the ship, brought a huge cargo, and that was the first big cargo of Chinese blue and white porcelain ever to get to Europe. It created a great sensation. They made a huge profit off of that sale. And then became a major diplomatic affair in Europe, because the Portuguese said, you're pirates. We're not at war, you can't capture our ship. And so this involved the British, because the British also were getting involved in the Straits of Malacca at the same time, and resulted in the composition of this essay, Mare Liberum, the freedom of the sea, by this Dutch lawyer Grotius. So how did they justify capturing this? It was based on the fact that the Pope had divided the world between the Portuguese and the Spanish, and put the dividing line somewhere which ran through the Atlantic Ocean, but the eastern side of South America was on the east side of the line. So Brazil became Portuguese, Mexico became Spanish, and the Philippines they couldn't quite figure out. Who had the right to that on the other side of the world? Where was that line of longitude? So about that at the time became a moot point for a while, because the Spanish and the Portuguese thrones were combined. So for a while it didn't make any difference. But Grotius then said, well, the Pope doesn't have the right to divide up the world. So we Dutch can sail wherever we want to. So we're defending freedom of the seas by attacking the Portuguese in Singapore. So he twisted the whole situation around. And so this became the legal framework for the modern law of the sea, the Santa Catarina affair off of Singapore. And the ship became known as, well, in the Portuguese, it was a kind of ship called a caraca, the Portuguese name for this kind of ship. And so in English, it got corrupted into crockery. So it came to mean crockery or pottery instead of a ship. That's how that origin of the word came about. So we have these other descriptions of Singapore in the early 1600s from the Europeans, like the Dutch say they saw a village and a beautiful harbor, and the fine bay, the town of Singapore, verifies that a Singapore settlement still existed, probably in the mouth of the Singapore River. This is a map of Singapore River Singapore in 1604. It mentions all these names of places which still exist. Tanah Merah, Sungai Bedok, Tanjung Ru. Those places all were here in 1600. Wherever there was a little stream coming down the east coast, there would have been a village at that time, and there would have been some population, which is probably now either under the condos or under the East Coast Parkway. But there's also a place called the Shabandaria, which is the harbor master. So there was a harbor master here still in 1604. And then there's the old strait, the new strait, Belakang Mati, the old name of Sentosa was still there. So there was still an authority here, a governmental authority, 1604. Now the Malay Annals, Celeber version says the Singapore chief in the time of Sultan Alauddin, when this version of the Malay Annals, the oldest known one we have, has the title Sri Raja Negara, very high sounding title. His glorious king of the country. And he was described as the vigorous leader of Johor's military forces, but he lived in Singapore. According to Cornelius Bataliev, still had a harbor master in 1606. 1607, the King of Spain and Portugal, they were combined, ordered the Viceroy of Goa to build a fort in the Singapore Strait, but they never carried out his order, obviously. A Dutch merchant named Jacques de Cout argued that, again, the Dutch ought to build forts on Sentosa and at the eastern end of the old Shabandaria, perhaps around what's now Tanamera or Bodok. Again, the recommendations never got carried out. So the Dutch urged United Spain and Portugal, because at this time, Netherlands was under Spain. This is how complicated European politics were at this time. So that gives another indication of why Singapore's history at this time is kind of complicated. He argued that the island has an excellent port and called Singapore a natural fortress. So Singapore's advantages were well known, but nobody got around to actually committing any capital to it. 1607, the Dutch East India Company had a fort way up the Johor River, but it was sacked by the Acehnese. The Acehnese from North Sumatra went all up the Johor River, attacked and destroyed the Dutch factory up there. So Peter Flores, who was an English sailor, passed through here later that year, doesn't mention any inhabitants except the sea nomads. Maybe the settlement at Singapore River estuary had been also attacked and destroyed by the Acehnese at this time. This is a period when the Acehnese of North Sumatra actually had a king who was from Pahang. So North Sumatra had a king from Malay Peninsula, and he hated the Malays of Johor because they were his rivals. And so he was attacking Johor and trying to make Aceh the center of the Malay world. And he wanted all the Malays to become Acehnese. And so that's why Singapore was again a target for the Acehnese way down here. So the Malay capital was then reestablished way down on Lingga at this time to get away from Aceh. Not so much away from the Europeans, but away from others claiming the mantle of being the kind of formers of Malay character. So the Sultan then agreed the Dutch could build a fort either at Karimun Island or up the Johor River estuary. Whoops, sorry. And so this became the years of the Portuguese. Of course, the Portuguese and the Dutch were great bitter enemies. Also, everybody was fighting everybody else. And Singapore was kind of the center of this whole struggle because of its strategic location, even though it didn't have a very large population at this time. So in 1619, the Dutch kind of circumvented the whole thing. So Singapore is too hot. There's just too much struggle going on, too much uncertainty. We're going to move to West Java. And that's what they did. They moved all the way down to West Java. The Chinese were also paying attention to Singapore at this time. There's a late Ming source called the Dongxiangkao, which refers to dangerous pirates in the Singapore area. So Singapore, the Chinese still called it Temasek in 1618. Obviously, the name had long changed, but the Chinese kept on the old names, which they had known for like 200 years. They still kept the name Temasek alive. The Chinese, however, also were more interested in West Java at the same time. And so they didn't settle at Singapore either. So there are these descriptions of the people who lived on shore in still the 1600s. People grew bananas, sugarcane, pineapple, but they couldn't see any houses. They were probably somewhere in the inland areas, which we haven't found the sites of yet. William Dampier, a famous English sailor and writer, the late 17th century, bought fruit and fish from Singapore's inhabitants and admired their boats. So at least they were important. In 1641, the Dutch say Singapore was one of the territories of Johor, and they said that it was rich in palm wine, which echoes what the Chinese said about Singapore in the 1300s, that Singaporeans made a really good kind of wine, probably made out of some kind of tuac. So Singapore was brewing alcohol. And it was one of its main industries, apparently, for hundreds of years, brewing alcohol, which is probably why we find these old Chinese wine cups of the Yuan dynasty on Fort Canning. They were drinking wine out of Chinese wine cups. So toddy palm So this, you can still a major industry. If you go to Myanmar today, you'll still see people probably doing it the way it was done in Singapore 300 or 400 years ago. These are the toddy palms, and here's a guy climbing the toddy palm up to tap the fruit. These are the containers they make them in. Here's how they distill it, just in these very traditional kind of clay ovens. But now they use these qualies. And we do find lots of these qualies and woks on shipwrecks of this period. They were importing these from China. The Chinese are making a whole industry out of making woks and qualies and shipping them to Southeast Asia. We find like stacks and stacks of them on the shipwrecks in the Java Sea. Maybe they're using them in their brewing industry. And here they are distilling it. They've got these tubes here, they boil it down. And these are the fruits of the tree. This is the kind of container of the stages. This is how they grind it up using the cattle. They do a very good job near the Bagan site in showing people how this is done traditionally. So here's the cow going around and around, grinding up the fruits and so on. So you can still see ethnographically how this might have been going on in Singapore. So dredging work on the Kallang Basin, of course, took place in the 1970s. And they did discover a lot of Ming porcelain, most of which was carried away by the people doing the dredging. We got very few of those to actually study. So there may have been some activity in the late 16th, early 17th centuries in Kallang, but we haven't found anything older than that. The Portuguese ships on patrol, they might have anchored there in the Kallang estuary, while waiting for the galleons to come down. But all this development, I'm afraid, has destroyed whatever hope we might have of finding out what role Kallang may have played in the early periods. So this is an intact plate, and this is one of the fragments of the porcelain found there. So it would have looked like that, and this is the fragment we found there. A very large and very impressive looking plate. And these are some of the other fragments found in the Kallang estuary by the dredges. This is one of the many sites which has been lost to us archaeologists. So what we find now is really a small portion of what could have been found in Singapore as recently as 30 years ago. So agriculture was still a major activity in Singapore in the early 19th century. But the Kallang area was very shallow. No big boats could get into that estuary. They used to take their boats in there at the high tide, but then they would be more or less stuck in the mud at low tide, but they were using that to clean the barnacles off the ships. So they take the ships up in the Kallang, let them fall over on their sides, and they could clean the bottoms, careen the ships, as they call it. So that's the one thing they did. It was not a major port, probably, in that area. So after 1643, the Dutch conquered Malacca, took it away from the Portuguese, but they moved most of the activities down to West Java here, Batam. And so that caused a gradual decline in the commerce in the Singapore area. And so that's another reason why 1600s, 1700s in Singapore is not a major center of trade. In 1673, the Raja Muda of Johor moved to Singapore. And after Johor, Lama was destroyed by another fleet from Jambi this time. So you can see all the fights going on in the Johor area. The Laksamana soon guided him to Bintan, however, and didn't remain in Singapore long. So Bintan then became a major center of this trading activity in the late 1600s and most of the 1700s, not Singapore. So that's another reason. There was another port in the Singapore area on Bintan instead of Singapore. So that's one reason, again, why we don't find too much here. We do find references to these clusters of houses in Keppel Harbor, 1695, but they were built over the water. And they had a customs house even still in the Keppel Harbor area this time. So this is Bantam. This is what was actually probably the major port at the time. You can see the mountains in the background. So at this time, what the Dutch had done, they developed a route which bypassed the Straits of Malacca. That's another reason. There were not Dutch ships coming down from India. They were going a totally different route. The Dutch learned that you could go straight east from South Africa, Cape Town, all the way to Australia with one wind, one monsoon. And so that's why Australia was discovered by the Dutch. It was originally called New Holland, after all. That's why you find old Dutch shipwrecks off the west coast of Australia. They figured out we can bypass the whole winds of the equatorial zone, the becalming, go straight west, get quickly across, hit Western Australia, go due north, hit the Straits of Sunda, and get right to Batavia. And so they didn't go by India, they didn't go by Singapore at all. They went straight across to the Straits of Sunda. And so they set up their port up here, West Java, Batam, about 90 kilometers west of Jakarta. So we find lots of evidence of this kind of activity in all the big ships. Here you can see again all the rowers on the ships. They had sails and rowers in these big ships. No doubt these were quite common sites in Singapore. This is the big archaeological site of Batam, and this is the mosque and the tower, the minaret, which still exists there from the 16th century. It's a very Javanese style mosque, the multi-tiered roof, just like the one in Jalan Eunos. Very Chinese influenced also. This is the minbar where the Qadi stands to give the sermon. You can see the Chinese influence on the architecture of this wooden place where the Qadi stands. And there's a Chinese mosque there, Masjid of the Chinese, Masjid Pecinan. And that's the remains of that old minaret there. That's the remains of the Chinese village. The modern temple there, which has still been restored many times. And this is the remains of the old palace. It's a very interesting site to look at for 17th, 18th century remains. There's remains of the moat around the palace, the gateway, and that place at the lower right is actually kind of a station on a pumping network, an aqueduct, which brought water into the city. It was quite sophisticated. So there was a lot of trade going on 17th century, but it was going mainly to West Java. Lots of nice big Chinese blue and white porcelain was coming there. And even Japanese porcelain, also the late 17th century. Early Qing, when the remnants of the Ming were still around, the Japanese also made porcelain for export to this region. Jan Peter's own Kuhn, this very famous founder, they have a famous founder of Batavia. This is what he looked like, and so he's the one who more or less had a big impact on the Singapore area by default, by moving a lot of the trade down to West Java. Then we find a lot of the Dutch descriptions of Batam at this period, the very busy harbor there. The Dutch man of wars, the Dutch, of course, had some of the biggest ships in the world at this period. This is the market. They made very good descriptions of the marketplace. Probably the Singapore River in the 14th century looked a lot like this. Areas like Empress Place, Parliament House Complex, they would have had these kinds of stands and so on, and that's how they would have done their marketing. We have the remains of the old Dutch fort in Batam. So 1685, of course, the Dutch took over Batam from the Javanese, and they expelled the British, that had been the British only major port in Southeast Asia from 1600 to 1685. 1685, the Dutch took over Batam, and so the British had to leave, and so where did they go? Bencoolen. Bencoolen was a major pepper growing area, west coast of Sumatra, not claimed by the Dutch, and so of course they moved up there. And so still some of the old British buildings from the 1600s are still standing. This is one of their old warehouses near the harbor in Bencoolen. Some of their old cannons, that's the old harbor master's house. This is one of the British monuments. Before there was the cupolas in the Fort Canning, there was this other kind of cupola. So they had a cupola already. And of course, when Raffles came and founded Singapore, he was living in Bencoolen because it was still the only British foothold in the whole South Sumatra area. The Bugis, however, were very influential in the Singapore area when Raffles got here. And so this is an old photograph of the Bugis of Singapore. And their costumes, they formed a very influential group in Singapore. That's why we have Bugis Street and Bugis Junction, and that's why the Malay Sultan built his palace near the Bugis area. The Bugis, of course, came mainly from southwest Sulawesi, this region around Makassar, and they already had a very long history behind them. They had their own writing system, as you can see, which is using the old style, which is similar to the old Javanese and Malay writing. They probably got the script from the Malays of the pre-Islamic period. And they had beautiful boats. They were long-distance sailors. There were many Bugis living in Malacca in the 1400s. The naval laws of Malacca mention specifically the Bugis living in Malacca. And they were also expert fishermen. The early anthropologists of the late 19th, early 20th centuries were very interested in the Bugis because of all the materials they made. Perishable types of fishing traps and these towers even with the nets and so forth. And they had their own battle flags, even though they had become Muslim after 1600. They still had a kind of pre-Islamic imagery in their battle flags. You see this guy at the lower right with a spear riding around on a winged horse. That's kind of like Indra on his mountain with the thunderbolt out of ancient Vedic mythology. And of course, it's very similar to the statue found at Empress Place. So this may represent the same kind of mounted figure. It might actually be Indra. But again, since we don't have enough context for the statue, we can't say just who this is meant to be. And one of the main things the Portuguese did was, the Bugis did, was build these large kind of graves. This is one of the early graves of the rulers of South Sulawesi, but the Dutch came in 1667 and conquered the Bugis area and built Fort Rotterdam, which is still there in Makassar today. And so there was a huge Bugis diaspora. One of them fled from the Dutch and came to the Singapore area. And so that's why you have the sultans of Selangor in Malaysia, they're of Bugis descent. They came in the 1600s to that area. A lot of them went to Sumatra, they went to the other islands of Riau. That's why we have these ancient and very large Bugis graves on Bintan. Dayang Merewa, on Dayang Celak, you can find these old Bugis graves there. They were very influential in Riau before they moved to Singapore after 1800. And there had been some earlier Islam already in Bintan. We find these old Islamic graves in Johor, we find them on Bintan, but not in Singapore yet. And so we have done some archaeological research on Bintan, looking for sites of the Temasek period, and we have found them. These are the two main rivers on the west coast of Bintan, which is sheltered from the northeast monsoon. So it is a good place to build your ports, and we have found lots of archaeological remains on those two estuaries, the Riau River and the Bintan River. And they have this nice big mountain there, which is a good landmark. And of course, lots of local people have been digging up the remains for decades. So they've been going around sifting, they were living over the water also down on Bintan. Nice shallow estuaries, and so the modern people go and sift all the mud and find all these ancient artifacts. Same kind of thing that probably could have been found in the Singapore estuary before it was dredged up about 15 years ago. Gold coins, Chinese statuary, glass beads. And there's still an old site called Kota Lama, old city up the river, and there's a place there which is called Kota Piring, or City of Plates, because there are so many broken porcelains still littering the ground. Again, it's the same kind of thing you find in the Kallang estuary, in the late Ming period. So big plates there, lots of commercial activity on Bintan, so Bintan was the center at this period. They were making their own coins there at this time, and also other kinds of materials out of tin. They did a lot of tin working. Some very beautiful imported Chinese porcelain. A few of these European tobacco pipes also. They did have some European vices by this period. And this very interesting little piece of tin in the shape of a ship. So they were doing a lot of very interesting metalworking. And probably they had been doing the same kind of thing in Singapore before at the Parliament House site. We found evidence of a lot of this kind of metalworking at the Parliament House location. Not coin making per se, but. So the Italian adventurer Francesco Ganelli Carreri traveled past Singapore in 1695, wrote a chapter in a book called Describing the Perilous Strait of Singapore and the people who live there. So there's an Italian visitor. And he said, he described Singapore. And then about 5 years later, a British sea captain happened by, a guy named Alexander Hamilton. And he wrote a book called The New Account of the East Indies, that the Johor River offered Singapore to him as a private individual. Here, you want Singapore? Take it, please. Because there's nobody living there, and I want someone to develop Singapore for me. But Hamilton said he couldn't accept it because he was only a ship captain, he only had one ship. He was a country trader, they called him. He was not a member of the East India Company. He was a private trader. And so he said, oh, I wish I had money. I could do a lot, but I don't have enough capital. So he says, I called the Johor on my way to China, and by the Sultan treated me very kindly and made me a present of Singapore. But it could be of no use to a private person, though the proper place for a company. In other words, it would be a good idea if the East India Company took it over. Lying in the center of trade and being accommodated with good rivers and safe harbors. So conveniently situated that all winds serving shipping both to go and out and come into those rivers. So he apparently did actually survey Singapore. And he was favorably impressed. He says, the soil is pretty good, nice and black and fat. The woods abound in good mass for shipping. And timber for building, I have seen large beans growing wild in the woods. So he must have wandered around in the woods in Singapore. Not inferior to the best in Europe for taste and beauty. Maybe he's talking about, I'm not sure what kind of beans, maybe patai. And sugar cane, 5 or 6 inches round. The sugar cane actually is indigenous to this region. It doesn't come from Latin America. Sugar cane is an indigenous Southeast Asian crop. So it's no surprise. It was not imported. It was growing in the Singapore region wild. But he doesn't mention any people on Singapore in 1700. This may have been one of the Johor Sultan's considerations in making him the offer in the first place. So 9 years later, some mysterious person made a map of Keppel Harbor. This map is in the British archives, and it's dated 1709. So somebody took Hamilton's suggestion seriously. Was it a member of the East India Company? We have no idea. It's not signed. It's in a bundle of papers which actually come from Bencoolen. But maybe somebody from the Bencoolen base came to look at Singapore then. And so there is Lot's wife, which is the old Long Yaman, or it was the Malay Batu Berlayar, entrance to Keppel Harbor. And there is Sentosa, the northern tip of Sentosa, and it's got all the soundings. So they went through and actually sounded the depths into Keppel Harbor. And it says, here the narrow straits of Singapore showeth as you ride there, both openings having east and west from one another, etc., etc. So again, 1709, we should look at this, but it took another 109 years until Raffles. Again, there was a huge gap between this. I don't think Raffles knew this map existed. He never mentions it. And so, pretender of the throne to this Johor named Raja Kecil, or Kecik, sometimes he was called, sent a messenger to Singapore to gather support from the sea people again. These are all these battles going on around the time of Alexander Hamilton. The leader of the sea people, Raja Negara, Singapore still had this kind of ruler who was probably a sea nomad. Then 50 years later, another war between the Bugis and the Siak on the mainland. Raja Ismail sailed to Singapore, where he treated the sea people harshly, forcing them to join his side and ordering them to prepare prahu and sampan, ships for him. So the Orang Laut here made ships for the Malays. And so they were obviously the experts who actually made the ships. The Raja Negara led his people in a sea battle against the Bugis. And of course the Bugis were here because they had been living here for some time, off of Tanah Merah, around 1767. So there are all these references to Singapore as a source of naval manpower and shipping skill as well. So there were definitely skilled people living here, but that's how Singapore was seen. That's Siak over there, just opposite Singapore, quite close by. So the Ming Dynasty fell 1643. Kangxi, the emperor who stabilized the Manchu rule, didn't take revenge on the merchants who stayed in Southeast Asia because they were still sympathetic to the old Ming loyalists. But the customs duties provided an important source of revenue for Guangdong and Fujian in the early Qing, as well as the imperial family. The British attention was focused on India during this period in their only Southeast Asian base, which was Bencoolen. 1786, the British began to pay attention again to Southeast Asia after a long, like 150 years, when they hadn't been doing much here. And a few years later, of course, Napoleonic Wars, Malacca came into British temporary possession. They took it to get away from the Dutch who had been conquered by the French. Around the 1800, that's when Southeast Asia began to emerge from the long slump. So this is another reason which led probably to the revival of Singapore. Trade as a whole in the world was reviving at this time, after a long period of decline or stagnation. So new British initiatives led to the founding of an East India Company settlement here, 116 years after Hamilton envisioned exactly the same course. So Singapore was not empty. It was not insignificant. The centers moved around a lot, from Malacca down to Bintan, down to Riau, Lingga, all the way down to Banten. But Singapore was never neglected, was always an important consideration, more as a pawn than a larger game. So Singapore was still strategic, and many people thought, oh, we should build a fort here, but it's not until Raffles that someone actually implemented this. Thank you very much for listening to my long story. Thank you. Great video. A lot of data, I know. But that's the unfortunate thing. So we don't have much archaeology from Singapore. We have to fill in the blanks by comparing it with these nearby areas. We have done some research on north shore of Bintan, and I know there were also sites on Batam, but I think most of them have been destroyed by modern development. We're still hoping we'll find sites of this period in Singapore. The finds at St. Andrew's Cathedral suggest that there should be some.
I know that you have a thick book, which I barely glanced through. So how does it actually relate to that book? That one actually covers a longer span of history, right?
Yes, that book is mainly about 14th century Singapore. But then I do have a chapter which is about Singapore's relationship with the region and the importance of Singapore's ancient history to its revival again. Because Raffles read the Malay Annals, he was well aware of Singapore having a great history. And he thought that was a main reason why he came here, because he thought Singapore is already well known among the population of Southeast Asia. He was interested in it as a way station between India and China, but he also was very interested in it for the riches he knew that Indonesia contained, because he had been the governor of Java for 5 years. He knew how much wealth could be obtained from the Southeast Asian trade. And he thought, well, Singapore is also ideally situated to take advantage of Java and the whole of the Spice Islands of Indonesia. So Raffles believed that Singapore was ancient. That's why he came here. But then people of Singapore, when I wrote that book 2013, didn't believe that. Neither did my professor. When I was a grad student at Cornell University, my professor had said, the whole Singapore episode of the Malay Annals is fictional. It's just a myth. And so when I came here in 1984 to do the first excavation, I disproved my own professor's thesis. I hope my students will do the same to me in the future. Hope they will find something I can't even guess at. So what does this mean? That means a lot for the whole interpretation of early Southeast Asian history, that the Singapore episode of the Malay Annals is not a myth, that it was strategic at one time, and then because of Singapore then giving support to archaeology over the past 35 years, and because there are quite fortuitously many sites in Singapore which are preserved for 700 years. It's the best known ancient seaport in the whole of Southeast Asia. You would think it must have all been destroyed. all the big new buildings and so on. But you look at the old ceremonial zone, the Padang, St. Andrew's Cathedral, the area around the Armenian church and so on, those are all untapped, unreconstructed. That turns out to be the center of the ancient city. So we're in such great luck that that's been preserved. And so I wrote the book mainly to document in exhaustive detail all the hundreds of thousands of items we have found, what the procedure of the research was, what was the reason why Singapore did arise at a particular point in time, and why did it then disappear again for a while. And so I usually like to talk about the rise. I don't usually talk about this blank period when it was not very important. But since that was what I was asked to do, that's what I did. And it's interesting to show that Singapore, always its importance was appreciated by various parties. But just for various reasons, nobody had the foresight or the kind of capital to do anything with it. But I do put that in at the end of my Singapore and the Silk Road to the Sea. I see there is another question in the back.
Hello.
Hi.
Testing.
Yes.
Yes. Assuming that Singapore did prosper once before under Sangnila Utama, did the Siamese and the aggressive European powers, was the Siamese the first to end that first era of Singapore's own prosperity before the Europeans?
That's okay. Yes. Yes. It's the Wang Dayan, who was this Chinese merchant, came to Singapore in the 1330s, and he wrote a fair description of Singapore, both the settlement around Fort Canning and the honest traders there and the pirates who lived on Sentosa. And he said that a few years before he got here, Singapore had been attacked by the Siamese. He uses the Chinese word xian, which comes from Siam. Now he says that the Xian came with about 70 junks, a huge fleet, and they attacked Singapore, where he was. But he says that the locals shut up their gates. They had a fort, they had defenses, and so the Siamese were laid siege for a whole month to Singapore, but they couldn't get in. They could not break the defenses. And so then an imperial envoy passed by, he says, and so the Siamese ran away. So the Siamese attacked Singapore, but they did not conquer it. But later on, it seems likely that Singapore, well, we know that Malacca paid tribute to Ayutthaya. So it's quite possible that also Singapore, Temasek period, did also pay some tribute to Ayutthaya after, say, 1351, when Ayutthaya was founded. Singapore was right at the southern end of the area that Siam claimed as its territory, and they also attacked places in Sumatra at this period. We have a lot of references to attacks by the Siamese on Aceh and even Jambi. But the Javanese were also attacking the same places at the same time. So the whole Straits of Malacca was at the kind of junction between the mainland empire and the island empire. And so Singapore probably had to pay tribute to both Siam and Java at the same time. But they paid off both sides, and therefore they were not attacked. So this is a cost of doing business at that time. So Siam did not conquer Singapore, but probably it was better to pay them off, to pay them tribute rather than to actually risk being attacked again. But Siam never conquered Singapore, as far as we know.
Did you say that Hang Tuah was probably a
I sure
Singaporean
did.
returning home?
Yes. That's what the
Have you
Portuguese
got
said.
evidence for that, please?
Yes. Okay, so the Portuguese just talk about the Laksamana. They don't say what his name was. But he said he was a great warrior. He was a stout, chivalrous person. And so after he was defeated, the Sultan left Malacca. He left the Sultan. He left also, and he went to Singapore. According to the Malay Annals, Singapore was the Malay naval base. It says it was the Jajahan, which is the fiefdom of the Laksamana. And so the Laksamana then had 40 three-masted cruisers based in Singapore, according to the Malay Annals. And so the Laksamana that was in charge of that fleet of 40 ships. And so besides the Malay Annals, we have references to this person in these Ryukyu archives. In the 1430s, already, after the last of the Chenghe voyages, China closed itself off. They conducted all of their foreign trade and relations through Okinawa, because Okinawa and the Ryukyus had a Chinese-style bureaucracy. And so they thought, okay, the Chinese said, okay, we'll deal with Ryukyu because we're not going to get culturally polluted. And Ryukyu then sent all these trading voyages to Southeast Asia. And we do have the records, but only parts of them ever have been translated into English. Ryukyu performed this service for about 50 years between the 1430s and the 1480s. And a summary of these has been published in English. And so they quote a couple Japanese scholars quote the Ryukyu records about, say, the ships going to Malacca. And they mention some letters from the Laksamana of Hang Tuah, Laksamana of Malacca. Again, no name, just I, the Laksamana, because that was good enough. I, the Laksamana, have saved your sailors, and I send them back to you. But I want gifts. I want a horse saddle. I want a saddle for my horse, so we can infer he had a horse. And I want a bow straightening tool, whatever that was. So it must have been an archer. Famous Malay skill was archery. And so he wanted some tool from Ryukyu to straighten his bow. And so then we have another letter from the Laksamana later on saying, thanks for the gift. So Ryukyu actually sent him those presents. And Okinawa, archaeologists, they're excavating one of the castles there in a 15th century site. They found a Malay crease. So it's all circumstantial. But given all the data we have, the Malay sources, the Ryukyu sources, the Portuguese sources, they all fit together, suggesting that it probably was true, that Laksamana was a Singaporean, and if there was such a person named Hang Tuah, he probably was based here. And Malaysia so far has not challenged this. I've given this lecture in Kuala Lumpur, and nobody actually could contradict me. So, any Malaysians here? People have other plans, I'm sure.
Thank you so much. That's good.
Thank you. Thank you for your time. Always a pleasure. Thank you.